Welcome to the Good Reading Magazine podcast, sponsored by Pantera Press. Good Reading is a monthly magazine dedicated to books and reading and aims to help readers discover their next favourite book. You can find out more about the books discussed on today's podcast at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.
Hi and welcome to the Good Reading podcast. Angus Dalton here with you. When it comes to Australia's world-famous flora and fauna, we associate their discovery with British men like John Gould and Joseph Banks. But of course, Aboriginal peoples have been living alongside Australia's wildlife for tens of thousands of years, and the sophisticated knowledge Indigenous people shared with early naturalists was vital for Western science's understanding of creatures like the world's only egg-laying mammals, the echidna and the platypus, and a whole range of other creatures like emus, lungfish and the black-breasted buzzard. But the Indigenous guides that helped European colonists through the unforgiving Australian landscape gathered thousands of specimens and shared their knowledge with early naturalists usually went unacknowledged. With a few exceptions, the vast majority of Australia's animals are named for white men. But a new book, Australia's First Naturalists, seeks to draw attention to the contribution made by Indigenous peoples to early zoology in Australia. I have the co-authors of the book joining me. One of them is Dr. Penny Olsen, who is an honorary professor in ecology, evolution and genetics at the Australian National University. Hi, Penny.
Hi, Angus.
And we also have Professor Lynette Russell, the director of the Monash Indigenous Studies Centre. Hi, Lynette.
Hi, Angus.
Thank you both so much for joining me. You've both written books about subjects like gender, Australian birds and Indigenous history, but what brought you two together to write this book?
Yes, well, I've written quite a few books on Australian natural history, particularly birds, and I kept coming across in the early accounts how much the Aboriginal people helped the early zoologists and early explorers who collected animals along the way. And I put a proposal to the National Library, and they liked it. Most of the voices I came across were, of course, European, so we thought we should engage someone with a bit more knowledge of Indigenous natural history, or is that the right word?
Well, Indigenous natural history knowledge and Indigenous behaviour and agency, particularly 19th century.
Penny, you've had a career as a field biologist. During that career, which animals did you focus on or work with?
Well, I started out with mammals, water rats and house mice, gone berserk in places like the Riverina as pests. And then my interest in birds grew and grew and grew. But birds of prey are my great passion.
How do you think your background as a field biologist, an ornithologist and a researcher of natural history helped you take on this project of Australia's First Naturalists and write the book?
Yeah, I guess I have an understanding of the biology of the animals, and also along the way I picked up quite a lot of the history of their discovery and naming and associated things like that.
Lynette, how did your work in anthropological history put you in a good position to research and write a book like this?
Well, my area of expertise is very much 19th century Aboriginal cultural histories. So a lot of what we do actually venture into the 20th century, I might add, but a lot of this is based in the 19th century. And my area of interest has always been looking at the ways in which Aboriginal people have engaged with colonisers. So I'm really looking at from both sides of the frontier, as to use a term that Henry Reynolds might have used. So my interest right from the start has always been, what did Europeans do when they encountered Aboriginal people, and how did Aboriginal people then respond to Europeans? So this was kind of an ideal project for me. Had just finished writing a book on the execution of 2 Tasmanian Aboriginal men in early Melbourne, and prior to that I'd been working on the Aboriginal people participating in the whaling and sealing industries. So I came from that solid 19th century background.
Both of you can have a stab at answering this question if you like, but why has the contribution Aboriginal peoples made to early zoology in Australia gone unacknowledged? Like, what are the reasons for that?
It hasn't gone totally unacknowledged, but just hasn't gone fully fully acknowledged, if you like. Part of the reason it's hidden away, it's hidden away in explorers' accounts and early journals and diaries and things like that. And it's often just a throwaway line, like, excuse the language, but the black boy climbed the tree and got the eggs. And in those days, the scientific world was very much concerned with naming and classifying the natural world, and that coincided with the discovery of Australia and its animals, and that was all coming from Britain and Europe. So all those early specimens went back, and the scientists there claimed them without acknowledging their source, their true source, which was some Indigenous collector who had collected it for, they'd gone through several hands. They'd gone through a collective for, sometimes it was an explorer collecting on the side, sometimes it was a dedicated natural history collector hired by someone in England, for example. So all the specimens just went back to England, and they were given classical names, sometimes named after friends of the Europeans to curry favour and get sponsorship and so forth.
And I'll just add to that for a lot of the early collectors and the early naturalists, they observed Aboriginal people as kind of just part of nature. They didn't see them as having knowledge. That what we've really looked at is Indigenous knowledge and how that actually was used and facilitated the early collectors. So while people didn't see them as cultural beings, they saw them as just part of nature. So they didn't really remark on their knowledge about either the fauna or the flora, despite the fact that they took that knowledge and made the collections.
Penny, I think you mentioned that you started to notice comments about Indigenous peoples helping with early colonists and their understanding of Australia just through sort of throwaway lines in diaries and things like that. So was that the main source of research that you were going through in order to write Australia's First Naturalists, going back through the records? Like, what were the most valuable sources of research in kind of finding these contributions that Indigenous peoples have made?
Yes, well, you're correct. So starting from the accounts of Cook and Banks and people like that, all the way through to into the 20th century, when there was a lot more acknowledgement of both of the help received and of the knowledge that was there, but it just has never been collected together before.
Once you have the lens that you apply to the actual records, it starts to jump out at you. You see the Aboriginal people there, and unless you have that lens, in a sense, you don't see them. And we were lucky because Penny, in particular, when she started looking at those records, had the lens. She was looking for Aboriginal people and they jumped out.
The first chapter of the book is dedicated to some of the ways that Aboriginal peoples used their zoological knowledge to thrive in pre-colonial times. Can you give some examples of how Aboriginal peoples demonstrated their advanced knowledge of zoology and animal behaviour?
Well, Aboriginal people have lived on the continent of Australia for at least 65,000 years. And during that time, there's been epic changes in the environment, massive changes in the flora and the fauna. We know that it's been colder and wetter, it's been hotter and drier. We've had the Ice Age come and go. So there's been massive changes. And throughout of all of that, they've maintained a society, they've actually thrived, and they've clearly been able to manipulate their environment. And manipulate's a bit of a problematic word, but they've been able to engage with their environment and understand how they could actually improve the environment in places so that they could increase the number of kangaroos or macropods or whatever it is that they might be wanting to harvest. So we know that they've been here 65,000 years. So in a sense, some of it's deduction. We can deduce that they clearly knew what they were doing because they've lived here for that length of time and they've thrived throughout that entire period. And archaeologists can tell us that there are periods when, particularly when it's a little bit wetter, for example, when Lake Mungo wasn't, as it is now, a dry, kind of moonscape, but in fact was an active, thriving lake. There were probably hundreds, if not thousands, of people convened around that lake. We can see the evidence of their campsites. We can see the evidence of where they ate, their fish remains, their shell middens, their ochre, their charcoal. So these are people who are thriving in an environment that the rest of us might find fairly harsh.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think my next question sort of feeds into that. There was a line early on in the book that was quite interesting. You write that prior to colonisation, Indigenous people didn't domesticate animals so much as domesticate landscapes. What do you mean by that? Well,
what happened was we don't necessarily in Australia, we don't really have animals that suit themselves to domestication, as you might imagine. Kangaroos and emus are not something that's easy to farm, nor should we be assuming that farming is the ideal way to engage with the landscape. But what Aboriginal people have done across this great millennia of occupation of this continent is they've created ecological niches, usually using fire. Fire has been the main the main tool and mechanism for creating these fantastically rich landscapes where they could actually have exactly the sorts of animals that they wanted. These were in fact low, cool fires. I've recently observed one of these fires, and literally as the fire was going out, the animals, small insects and small mammals, were actually popping up out of the ground. It wasn't a hot bushfire like we see when we have, nasty bushfires in our summers. So that's the kind of domestication of a landscape that I'm talking about. And in places like, say, Western Victoria, where you've got the eel aquaculture landscape, that's a domestication of a very different kind, where you've got people creating, building, construction, massive weirs, fish, what we call them eel fisheries, massive constructions that were able to hold and harvest eels over very long periods of time.
And that also nicely illustrates how they understood quite a lot about the life cycles of the eels as well. They trapped them on the way out to the sea to spawn.
Yeah, that's such a fascinating part of the book. And is it right that next to those sort of eel fisheries, Australian Aboriginal peoples would set up more permanent sort of camps or villages, which sort of busts that stereotype, I guess, of them as hunter-gatherers?
Certainly hunter-gatherers they are and were, but I think that what it really, the stereotype that it really breaks apart is the idea of basically highly mobile wanderers, as if they just wandered across the landscape without rhyme nor reason. And clearly the permanency of the villages, particularly in Western Victoria, there's also some permanent villages in Western Australia. Those sorts of permanent structures, we're talking about stone houses, stone fish weirs, stone fish traps and the like. This is about people who live in the environment, if not permanently, certainly on a semi-permanent basis, and they're not just wandering around. The term when I was a kid was always, they're nomadic, Aboriginal people were nomadic. We don't really hear that term so often now, because I think we've really realised that it is not a very accurate characterisation of their engagement with their landscape.
There's an interesting anecdote in the book about how the word kangaroo came to be adopted by non-Indigenous people. Can you tell us about that miscommunication that occurred when Eora people first taught the word to Sydney's colonists? Yeah, well, when Sydney was settled, Port Jackson was settled, the First Fleet officers knew of the Cooks and Banks journals, and the Endeavour had beached. Well, they had to beach the Endeavour River to do repairs, and that's when there was the first encounter with the macropod. There's argument about which one. It wasn't necessarily an eastern grey kangaroo, but one of that group was collected and famously went back to England. And
one of them must have asked the local people what they were called, and they thought they said kangaroo. And there is evidence that that's what they called the male kangaroos in that part of the world. But anyway, when the First Fleet officers came to Sydney, they brought that name with them, and they were trying to get the local people to understand what it was, and they just assumed the whole country had the same language, but of course there were hundreds of languages, so they didn't have much luck.
Lynette, I read that you've tried to get your tongue around Indigenous languages and found it quite difficult.
Very difficult.
Yeah. How common was it for colonists to attempt to learn Indigenous languages? Like, were miscommunications like this quite common?
Miscommunications are extremely common. Take, for example, in Victoria, particularly when the establishment of Melbourne, what they call the Aborigines Protection Board was established, and they decided that they would put in place a number of protectors, and these protectors were to learn the local languages, and almost without fail, they did not learn the language. So Aboriginal languages are very difficult to learn. We also need to appreciate that most Aboriginal people were multilingual. So when we're talking about there's 250 different discrete Aboriginal languages and 600 plus Aboriginal tribal groups, what we're looking at is people who could probably speak 3, 4, 5, even 6 different Aboriginal languages, and they would have been fluent in each of them. Monolingual Europeans found it very difficult, and Aboriginal languages, in my own experience, I'll guarantee, my tongue just refuses to cooperate, and it seems to move all around my mouth and not make the right sounds. So I'm quite in awe of anyone who can pick up an Aboriginal language, because they're not easy by any means. So a lingua franca definitely developed a pidgin English, as it were, or a Creole. I know in the Tasmanian context they often refer to it as Hobart Town language, which is a kind of Creole of Palawa language and English.
You also write in the book that not only was there this language divide between the Europeans and the Indigenous Australians, but also a cultural gulf in ways of seeing the natural world. What was this cultural gulf? How differently did the European colonists and Indigenous peoples see the natural world?
This is probably the most profound, from my perspective, because what Aboriginal people would be saying, and I think even many Aboriginal people would say today, they don't see the natural world. They are part of it. They are the environment. Whereas Europeans, we still have that sort of culture-nature divide. We even talk about, is it nature or is it nurture when we're talking about various types of, human behaviour. So Aboriginal people, and in fact Indigenous people on the whole, because we shouldn't forget also the Torres Strait Islanders, on the whole, see the environment, see the landscape, see the ecology and all of that they live in as being part of their culture. It's not just nature the way we talk about nature for us is, thunderstorms and rain and drought, whereas for them that's actually culture too.
Yeah, absolutely. Penny, did you sort of get a new appreciation for how Indigenous people saw the natural world, like as a biologist as well?
No, I think probably I'd have to say no. I think I had a reasonable idea that they viewed it very differently, and that was part of the problem, if you like, in communications in those early days. That science was. It was a point in history where science was separating off from art and philosophy and those other sort of areas that in the European world we'd begun to put things in boxes. So the colonists with the scientific bent were thinking in that way, and the local people just didn't see things in that way. So, for example, some Aboriginal groups categorise an emu as a mammal because it walks on the ground and it doesn't fly. So that's their way of categorising an emu, whereas we scientists put it clearly in the bird group. So it was just a very different way of seeing the world, and as Lynette said, it's just all interconnected. It was science and religion and cultural practices like art and dance and ceremony. They felt they were kin to the...
Absolutely. They were the non-human kin.
Mm.
Speaking of this sort of the cultural divide or differences, while writing this book, Lynette, what kind of issues did you have to keep in mind so you didn't inadvertently sort of feed into colonial stereotypes non-Indigenous people might have of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders?
I think the key one for me is always around victimhood and not demonstrating or exploring or appreciating Aboriginal agency. So I'm very keen. I mean, I don't think we can pretend that the contact period wasn't at times violent, filled with disease and devastation. But at the same time, I think it's really important that we don't just focus on that, but in fact we also consider the multitude of ways in which Aboriginal people engaged with the colonists. And that they demonstrated their own agency. And I think there's some lovely examples of that in the book. The children who keep coming back for the lollies, because they're what they're doing there is they're actually saying, we're engaging in this on our own terms, and we're going to get the payment for it. And there's a whole range of lovely vignettes like that in the book, I think, that demonstrate that those kind of stereotypes of Aboriginal people as victims are really quite dangerous.
You write about some of the early naturalists that sort of held this notion of white intellectual superiority towards Aboriginal peoples, but who were some of these naturalists that you write about in the book who really embraced the knowledge and expertise of Indigenous people?
One of the earliest was George Cayley in Sydney from 1800 to 1810. He was sent out by the great botanist Joseph Banks mainly to collect plants, but along the way he developed an interest in birds, and Banks also sent him out to get things of interest like echidnas, because of the fascination with the fact that there were mammals that laid eggs, and that was unknown anywhere else in the world, and indeed not accepted for a long time as being possible. And Cayley actually was someone who he formed a close relationship with a young Indigenous man called Mewatan, and he learned the language of the Eora, and really enjoyed his relationships with them, and didn't always sit well with some of the other officers, but didn't stop him.
Yeah, and what would the benefit or advantage of Cayley's relationship with this young Indigenous man, Mewatan, have been in terms of his discoveries and contributions to gathering specimens and things like that? Well,
it became pretty obvious when I gathered all the material. We gathered all the material together for the book, that expeditions that didn't take Indigenous guides, or they weren't always guides, some of them were engaged, but specifically to collect material. But I presume they also helped with as a guide as well. But anyway, those people who didn't take Indigenous help came back with far fewer discoveries than those who did.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong in any parts of this story, but is it right that George Cayley and Daniel Mewatan went back to England together, and when Mewatan returned to Australia, he ended up sort of being part of this legal case that was quite interesting. It was the first time that an Indigenous person was persecuted under the law in New South Wales, is that right?
Yes, that was all very sad, and I'm not sure that he wasn't in fact framed, but I guess we'll never know. But yes, there'd been a change in the law so that Indigenous people had to abide by British law, whereas up until that point they were not obliged to. And he was the first that suffered from that.
Yeah, is it fair to say that in these relationships that formed between early naturalists and Indigenous people, that quite often the Indigenous people got the worst end of the deal?
I think, it's complicated.
It is complicated.
Yeah.
I'd hate to think that we were giving an impression that all of the Aboriginal people were mistreated, because they weren't, nor were they all celebrated, like Muwatan was at least at one stage in his life. I think it's clear to me that the kinds of relationships that the early naturalists had with their Aboriginal and Indigenous collectors ranged from everything from exploitative to genuine friendship, and I think everything in between.
Penny, you've written a book called Night Parrot, Australia's Most Elusive Bird, and the night parrot is one of those creatures that crops up in Australia's First Naturalists. First of all, for people who don't know how interesting this bird is, can you just tell us quickly why this parrot is so notorious nowadays?
This is a nocturnal parrot that's always been very elusive in its behaviour, and it hadn't been until 2013. It hadn't been definitely seen for around a century, despite numerous ornithologists and bird watchers really trying hard to go out and find it. There are always the odd observation of truckies driving along at night and seeing this bird flush, but nothing confirmed for a very long time. So it became the holy grail of the bird world. And then this naturalist called John Young produced some photos and a little video of a bird that he got in 2013. And he taped the call, so the calls gave us a means to look for more populations. As you can, we call it call playback. You play the call, and if there are birds in the area, they don't always, but they often answer. So it was finally we had the key to finding more populations. The trouble is that John got a bit carried away and discovered rather more populations than there actually are.
Yeah, but initially, what was the role of Indigenous people in bringing the attention of Western science to this now almost mythological bird?
It's I could only find bits and pieces, but they were certainly involved in those very early. Maybe not the first one, but certainly a guy called Frederick Andrews, who collected for the early Adelaide Museum. He was the most successful collector of night parrots ever. He collected 20-something out of the 28 or so that are in specimens that are in museums around the world. And they're extremely sought after, right from discovery that they were a new species. There are indications from some of Andrew's letters that he used the Indigenous people to achieve this great success, because he writes to his minder in the Adelaide Museum that he's used up his month's salary, so he can't hire any others, and on another occasion that he can't find any that are interested in going out to look to help him. He doesn't specifically mention night parrots, but he was in that part of the country where he was collecting night parrots. So indirectly, there's evidence that his great success in collecting this extreme rarity was down to the local Indigenous people.
One of the more famous naturalists that you write about is the esteemed ornithologist John Gould. Can you tell us some of the ways that his discoveries were facilitated by Indigenous people?
Right from the start, when Gould landed in Tasmania, in Hobart, there weren't many Indigenous people available on mainland Tasmania, on the island Tasmania, because the Palawa had been basically sent into exile to Waibelina on Flinders Island. But Gould made a trip to Flinders Island, and there he did engage with them straight away, and they took him on trips across the island, and he collected the mutton bird eggs and Cape Barren geese eggs and so forth with their help. He also met a young Indigenous boy called Adolphus, whose Palawa name was Timernadik. I'm not sure if that's the right pronunciation. Who he said had eyes like an eagle, and it was fabulous with a spear and a waddy, and he helped him find birds and bird nests in particular, and he was tasked with taking Adolphus back to Sir John Franklin and Lady Franklin to educate, just as they took on Mathina, but it's much less well known that they also took on other Indigenous kids that, without great success, I think it must be said.
No, indeed.
So that was his first encounter on Flinders Island, and then when he visited the hunter, his brother-in-law and the hunter, Natty and Jemmy, he met Natty and Jemmy and formed very close relationship with them. He loved their sense of humour and their keenness to find him birds and discuss natural history things with him, because that was his passion. And so they took him out, and he first encountered great swarms of budgerigars with them, and all sorts of other mammals as well as birds. And when he went back to England, he kept writing to his brother-in-law to, tell Natty and Jemmy that to please keep collecting for me, and, how much I enjoyed my time with them.
Yeah, that just reminded me, listening to how these Indigenous people led so many of these naturalists to these, great discoveries, like seeing these big swarms of budgerigars for the first time, that one of the coolest parts of the book, and I think there's some illustrations of this as well, is how some Indigenous men were observed sticking bits of cobweb to bees and then sort of following the bees back to the hives. Like, that's so fascinating.
Ingenious, yeah.
It is genius, yes. Slow them down just enough to be able to see them and follow them, because they obviously fly in a straight line.
What I find really interesting about talking about this book now is that we're talking a day or two after the release of that UN report that revealed 1 million species of animal are at risk of extinction because of humans' impact on the planet. One of the recommendations that report made to try and nullify the damage is that Indigenous knowledge should be protected and used in managing ecosystems. So in light of that recommendation, what do you think we can learn from your book moving forward in terms of conservation and our continued understanding of zoology?
In the 20th century, that when most of our higher animals, as they're called, that's reptiles, birds and mammals, have been discovered, that the Indigenous people were still teaching us things. So, for example, the Blandowski expedition that went out to the junction of the Murray-Darling rivers, they got there just before, or just as settlement, just as the stock and European settlers were arriving. And with the help of a whole tribe, Blandowski managed to collect a whole lot of mammals in particular that are no longer with us. And it was, the first signs of the damage that we were doing. That was back in 1856, 57.
Wow.
Certainly, if we look at the contemporary Indigenous land management practices and the Aboriginal ranges, especially those across the top end and the centre of Australia, in the areas that are less populated, say, we can really see a huge impact that they're making on their environment, and both in terms of the management of feral animals, but also in terms of management of native animals. And I think it is at our peril that we ignore their very deep, long and sophisticated understanding of the relationships that those animals and plants and flora have in those environments. So, I mean, I find it deeply sobering that we're talking about a million species being threatened by extinction. Humans have done, Europeans in particular, have done a pretty thorough job in so many parts of the world that I think it really is up to us now to stop and listen. And I hope that some of what we touch on in the book might actually at least offer a framework for thinking about how we can use Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous faunal and ecological and environmental knowledge going forward into the future.
Absolutely. I think in light of the recommendation that report made to have a book that puts Indigenous knowledge of zoology and ecosystems front and centre is really fantastically timed and really fascinating as well. Thank you so much for joining me to chat about this book, Penny and Lynette. It's been absolutely fascinating to hear you talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Angus.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Good Reading Podcast. Australia's First Naturalists by Penny, Olsen and Lynette Russell is published by the National Library of Australia, or NLA Publishing, and it's out now at all good bookshops, including Good Reading's online store at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.